Without further ado, our opening panel, Wesley, I will turn it over to you. I'll let you introduce yourself, let the panelists introduce themselves. A great fitting topic to get us kicked off. All you, my friend.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Good morning. So to start the discussion today, we're going to be talking about the state of New York City sustainability, understanding compliance benchmarks with respect to Local Law 97. I'm Wesley O'Brien, a partner in the real estate group at Fried Frank, where I serve as Land Use, Zoning, and Environmental Review Counsel on major New York City development projects. If I could ask each of the panelists, beginning at the far right side, to introduce themselves.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Samuel Mann. I'm a senior. Good morning, everyone. My name is Samuel Mann. I'm a senior policy advisor at the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. Yeah, super happy to be here. This is such a perfect time to talk about Local Law 97, decarbonization. I'm a born and raised New Yorker, veteran of the United States Marine Corps Reserves, and have been serving the city of New York for the last 6.5 years.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Adam Shelley. I'm a project development engineer for Ecosystem Energy. We're an integrated engineering and construction company that specializes in decarbonization in the Northeast.
Hi, my name is Mick Gilbert. I'm the Director of Energy and Sustainability at Fairstead. We are a vertically integrated owner-operator developer. Just a few vital stats. We have, and I need a cheat sheet because we're growing very rapidly and these numbers seem to change every week. We have about 16,500 apartments. We're in 18 states, about 25,000 residents. Of that 16,500, 11,500 are affordable, which creates its own set of intricacies in terms of decarbonization, sustainability, and 5,000 are market rate. In New York City, there are 6,600 units, of which 3,600 are market and mixed income, and 3,000 are Section 8 LIHTC. We've also started a $100 million investment fund to invest in PropTech specifically, to help bring PropTech solutions and decarbonization solutions to the affordable market.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Zach Steinberg. I'm a Senior Vice President for Policy at the Real Estate Board of New York. We're a 15,000 member trade association representing lots of people who do real estate, including a whole bunch of people in this room. So nice to see everybody, and thanks for including me.
Hi, I'm Hannah BRONFMAN. I might be the loudest person on this stage, I think. I'm a director at Code Green Solutions. We are a consulting firm. Our main focus is on making things happen, actually. So I'm excited to be on this board and support this conversation with these different stakeholders.
Great. So as part of the Climate Mobilization Act in May of 2019, the New York City Council passed Local Law 97, which has been described as the most ambitious law in the world to tackle emissions from existing buildings. It's estimated that the law will affect 57,000 buildings in New York City. So, Samuel, to provide some background for those of us who aren't as familiar with the law, could you please give us an overview of the Local Law 97 requirements and some of the timelines?
Absolutely. And before I go into some of the specifics, I just want to highlight what the Climate Mobilization Act, or specifically what Local Law 97 is set up to do. And by 2030, if we do this right, we will reduce around 6 million tons of carbon equivalent from the city. And that's roughly 10% of citywide emissions. And put that into perspective, that's about the equivalent of removing 1.3 million cars off the road annually. And put additional context around that, there's around 2 million registered vehicles in New York City. So imagine taking 2/3 of all cars off the road every year for the rest of, for as long as we're around. So I think it's a really impactful law, and it's super critical for us to get it right. So in addition to carbon emissions reductions, we're talking about green jobs. This is set up to create over 26,000 green jobs by 2030. So this is important for the economy, for human health, and of course for environmental performance. So where we are right now, it feels like the first emissions limit comes into effect in 2025, and that feels like it's like 2025, 2030 is a long time away. But when you get into planning and get into project implementation, you find that these things do take time. So it's really important to get started right now, even while we are figuring things out, while Department of Buildings is in the process of releasing guidelines to provide more clarity about how to comply with the law. All of that's happening right now. That's why it's such an exciting moment. And I would say stay tuned for more information. And one way we're getting that word out is, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, about the New York City Accelerator Program. I think it's a really important resource for all private building owners trying to figure out how to comply Local Law 97, how to orient yourself to the law based on how many affordable housing units you have in your portfolio, and just where you stand, how to plan for it, long-term decarbonization plans. So yeah, this is a really important moment in time, and I think January 1st, 2023, which is a couple of months away, we'll have a lot more clarity about exactly, all the details about how to comply, how to verify your compliance, and all these different things.
And what are the reduction goals for 2025 and beyond that?
So what are the reduction goals? It really depends on what kind of building you operate. It depends on what kind of occupancy usage type you operate. And the way that's currently set up is that based on the type of building you have, you multiply the greenhouse gas emissions coefficient with your gross square footage. So it's a little bit of math involved, but essentially you have a carbon budget, and staying under the budget is how you avoid getting fined.
And Adam, I know you're really in the trenches on this. What types of decisions in the short term are building owners and developers making in order to ensure that they can comply in 2025?
Yeah, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. Can everyone hear me okay, by the way? I can't tell if I'm whispering or yelling up here. Okay, great. So there's decisions that are financial and there's decisions that are technical, and they're being mixed together right now in a way that they haven't before. So we're sort of putting different building owners in 3 different groups. There's one group that's not doing anything now, and they're going to ride this out and see what sort of fines they're going to get. There's another group that's saying, I want to avoid fines or whatever questions are going to come down in the future, and electrify now. And then there's a lot of people who are doing a mix. And I think that mix is really important. The way that we're describing it is resource efficient electrification. So energy efficiency is still key in this decarbonization model. So don't forget about that. I know we've been heavy on that in New York City for years. That's still a key part of the solution. The other part is figuring out how you're going to decarbonize and get off fossil fuels. So the first thing that people are looking at is domestic hot water. We think that's a great solution. And then it's what steps do you need to get off the rest of the space heating usually. That's the biggest emitter. So in order to accomplish that, you really need to reduce your energy, but then think ahead, how do you accomplish that? And that needs to start being done now so that you don't have a huge expense in the future.
And Hannah, specifically, what are some of the best solutions and immediate upgrades that can be made to buildings?
Well, I think there's a misconception generally that just a technology will solve it. It's not how it works, and it's not how it should work. There's a myriad of solutions that need to be combined, from how you procure energy, to who makes decisions, to who installs things, and how you underwrite and fund these items that need to be solved first. So prioritizing that, and then as the evolution and innovation comes with technology and the grid starts to clean, that will happen over time. But it's not about hey, this heat pump will solve your day, or this thing will solve your day. There's no silver bullet here. It's really about progressive thinking and planning and prioritization, and then also getting the people who have the purse strings on board, because that's really been the biggest challenge.
And Michael, did you have any further thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think most of us look at this from either a financial and engineering perspective, which is certainly my background. Since coming over to Fairstead, one of the things I've got a much greater appreciation of is what are the actual logistic and physical constraints to doing this? How intrusive is electrification on residents? So as I said, most of our units are affordable. This tends to be people's only residence. They don't have as many options for moving out. We specialize in-place rehab to minimize disruption. But as Adam said, it's very intrusive changing a 1 or 2 pipe steam heating system to air source heat pumps. It's much less intrusive to do water systems, which take 25 to 30% of the gas and CO2 load. So I think, we all kind of think about this from top level, but there's scheduling, there's all the logistics of trying to actually do this in-unit work. And the other thing I would think about is, if you could bifurcate things that kind of go on in boiler rooms, common areas, hallways, rooftops, to things that actually have to happen within a residence unit.
I think that's, sorry, just to jump on that, I think that's really interesting because one of our sibling companies is a code compliance company, and a lot of what they do is they're like, that won't fit there.
Right.
Quite literally, that won't fit there. And so I think that there's a lot of logistical, on the ground considerations that need to go into it all. So I agree.
And one thing I would add on the technical side, even in common areas, you're often constrained by the physicality of the space. So we had looked at air source heat pumps for DHW in a building. There just was not enough airflow to act as the heat source or the heat sink for that larger building.
Just in general, this is a time to get creative, and in order to do that, you need to think ahead, more so than the traditional cycle for your assets.
Can you tell the three of us are like on board with this? We're like, you guys get it in now.
So with owners and developers beginning to make the capital improvements necessary to comply with the law, Zach, what do energy consumption levels look like in New York City in 2022, and how does this compare with the years before?
Yeah, so we have a lot of data about this, some quality issues about the data, I think many people would say, but fortunately we've got a decade plus of benchmarking data from buildings in New York City, and we can learn a lot from that. And certainly we've seen, I think in recent years, set aside 2020, 21 because the pandemic changed a whole bunch of things, but it does seem like we are making progress in reducing emissions and using less energy. One thing that has happened in recent years that has obviously thrown a wrench into that is we closed Indian Point, which meant our electricity went from like 3/4 natural gas to 90% natural gas, and so that's obviously resulted in a bump in emissions. So by and large, I think it's important to think about, just in terms of the energy profile of buildings, the distinction between the residential sector and the commercial sector. The commercial sector, broadly speaking, is much more electrified today than the residential sector, and so that's going to result in different compliance strategies and different choices for that sector versus the residential, where you're looking much more at challenges for local law compliance due to energy usage that really stems from having natural gas and fuel oil boilers in the buildings.
So do you see the residential sector as having the most difficult time complying with the law?
Yeah, I think over time, the way the law is designed, commercial buildings, residential buildings, based on your occupancy type, you're looking at something like 20% of the covered buildings being, quote unquote, out of compliance in 2024. At least that was the idea when the law was drafted. What you're going to see happen over time as grid decarbonization proceeds, and particularly if it proceeds at the pace that the state climate law dictates it should proceed at, in the aggregate, you're going to see the emissions from the commercial sector get driven down much more rapidly, simply because the grid is doing a lot of that work. Now, there's a lot of, obviously, there's been city council hearings, there's been a lot of advocacy about whether that's a good or a bad thing. I think the reality is, if the goal here is that we're trying to reduce carbon emissions, we really need to focus on rapidly getting emissions out of our electricity generation, because otherwise, if we're sitting here 5 years from now and we're still getting 90% of our electricity from natural gas, no one's complying with any law, no matter how well intentioned it is.
And are others seeing the residential assets really being the focus of capital improvements right now?
I think there's some of both, right? I think the folks hinted at this a little bit earlier, but they present different challenges. So I think we represent a lot of the Class A commercial owners, and I think you see them, they're pretty far ahead of the curve. They've been doing a lot of the energy efficiency work that people have been looking to drive down energy consumption for years, decades. And so, for some of them, I think it's, they're looking out and they're probably, many of them not paying penalties in the 2024 period, but they're certainly worried about what 2030 looks like. They're probably moving forward some of those capital improvements. They're certainly making plans today to try to figure out how to deal with that. The residential stock, I think, is different. You just have a much different level of sophistication in that community, and you're dealing with not just some large rental owners, you're dealing with a lot of co-op condos with volunteer boards, you're dealing with a lot of smaller owners, and that's a much more difficult conversation because the point we were getting at earlier, right? You're talking about access into the apartments that people live in order to do a lot of this work, and that gets harder.
Yeah, Hannah, I see you nodding. Is that your experience
I'm
as well?
just thinking about, I don't want anyone to come into my apartment and tell me what to do. So it's really difficult to convince people in their homes to change, and it's a lot of liability as well. And I think that we're challenging that. The commercial side, I'm seeing such a big uptick in commercial and industrial really investing in this and thinking ahead, and it's really difficult in residential. So I'm not experienced in that, and I'm just thinking about my personal experience.
Adam?
Yeah, we're working with a multifamily apartment building right outside of Union Square. And right now they have a building that switches over, and they run on natural gas for both heating and cooling. They're taking this as an opportunity to convert right now and electrify 80% of their heating. So why 80%? Because that's what the building footprint allowed for, and it also achieves all the goals through 2050. It's a hybrid way of thinking. So the advantage of that decarbonization is obviously financial, but also the comfort of the occupants. They can now heat and cool simultaneously any time of the year. That was a huge benefit to them. And the incremental cost over just replacing their existing system more than pays for itself when you factor in all the penalties and the operations costs of maintaining the natural gas system and their boilers.
So now that we're moving towards compliance, Zach, what are some of the main issues with Local Law 97 that REBNY is hearing about?
Yeah, I think, as a starting point, I think there still remains quite a bit of uncertainty, right? I mean, there are not a lot of rules written yet about how to calculate emissions on a more granular level for your building to understand what is your carbon budget. There still are a lot of gaps in how we're treating distributed energy. There's gaps in how are we going to allow for or not allow for renewable energy credits. So there remains a lot of uncertainty and unknowns just in terms of what those compliance pathways under the law will actually look like. I think the other thing you see is a lot of property owners really trying to figure out, okay, how do we get ahead of this, right? One of the things we see happening in the commercial sector, which I think is really encouraging, is a interesting confluence of tenants and owners both having their own ESG commitments, looking to make progress into this space and trying to figure out how we work together through leases and through other steps to try to bring things together. But I think the thing we also hear a lot of, to be frank, is a lot of concern from the residential sector just about how they're going to get into compliance over time and what it's going to mean for their properties.
And Hannah and Michael, what types of issues are you seeing?
A lot of the issues that I'm finding are related to financing. So how do you pay for this? What you just mentioned about not knowing exactly how it's going to play out is difficult to build a pro forma. It's difficult to underwrite. It's difficult to understand what an NPV looks like if you have X emissions, right? So, and that fine associated with it. So that's really where we've been focusing a lot, is helping the decision makers create the financial case. So thinking about installing on-site storage or solar, that equation becomes really different if you have, $300,000 in fines. It starts to shave off and change the way it looks. So that's really where we've been focusing. And then from there, convincing people to do it. And then from there, actually getting it done. So that's kind of the cascade.
One thing I would add, in addition to the real-world logistics issues I mentioned before, especially in an affordable building, if you'd say the main responsibilities of an owner-operator is to provide space heating, comfort, and hot water. Right? Those are going to be the big CO2 drivers. It's very, very difficult to change who pays for what. So when we think about electrification of a centrally heated building that's running off of gas and a steam or a hydronic system, and now we want to put in these cool heat pumps and give them air conditioning, which they didn't have before, that gets into a lot of technical issues when you say who pays for the CapEx, who pays for the OpEx, what does that do for the building economics? Again, because in affordable, you generally cannot raise rents. And so even if you took a thought experiment where all the CapEx was given to you Right now, in a typical New York City multifamily building, I'm talking of relatively low-tech buildings like the ones you see around here, you would drive up OpEx for heating and for hot water.
So, Adam, if you could speak for a minute, we're turning, I guess, now to the darker side of the law. What types of penalties are there if people do not comply?
Thank you for making me responsible for answering the darker side of the law. So there's a $268 penalty per ton of carbon over that allowance that you're getting based on the calculation. So every building has a certain category based on its occupancy code, and you're multiplying that out and seeing what your allowance is. Anything that exceeds that, you're going to get penalized for every single year. That allowance reduces in 2030, so it can potentially be very huge. Hannah was mentioning it earlier. There's hundreds of thousands of dollars every year that you could be penalized for. And they have the right to adjust that in the future after 2030. I still think they're figuring out some of the details of the bill, but we're past the point of, is this going to happen or not, which I've heard in the industry since the law was introduced. This law is happening. The details are still being finalized, but the magnitude of those penalties are almost locked in at this point.
And do you all find that building owners are concerned about compliance and the penalties that will possibly come, or is this still an abstract thing that's happening in the future?
I think COVID really set everyone back on priorities, and we should just acknowledge that. But now it's time to shift those priorities back, and I've had some pretty jaw-dropping conversations over the last 3 weeks because budgeting season's coming up for everyone, and it's like, we need to get our building restacked. No one's in it. But at the same time, we have these fines coming. So I think that the recognition is starting, but it's like it's almost like we're just jumping off the cliff now.
Has that been your experience as well?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I have a slightly different take, which is I think our members have been incredibly attuned to this law since it was proposed and went through various drafts and is now being implemented. I get the impression that there's a lot of focus on this, particularly among the larger, perhaps more sophisticated real estate companies in the city. And I think in large part because a lot of these firms have really good stories to tell, right? A lot of these firms have been taking steps for years to do all the kinds of things that the city has been asking of them, that partners at the state level have been asking of them. And there's a lot of interesting innovation happening. You look at some of the people taking advantage of various NYSERDA challenge programs or participating in the mayor's challenge programs. They're really leading the way on pretty significantly reducing emissions and energy consumption in their buildings. Is that adequate to reach all of the long-term goals of Local Law 97? I think that's an area of concern, but I do think a lot of these owners are taking pretty interesting and thoughtful approaches to trying to move this conversation forward.
Can I ask you a question? A follow-up. Of the numbers that you stated in square footage, how much of that is Class A versus not? That's impacted. Because I agree with you. Our Class A clients are really progressive. Our Class B ones, we're still trying to figure that out.
Yeah, I mean, somebody else on
I'm
this
sorry,
panel,
I didn't mean to
somebody
put you
else
on the spot
might have
either.
this, and somebody in the audience probably knows the answer to this question better than I do, but my sense is, if 20, 30, 40% of the commercial market is Class A and the rest is something else, I do think that's a pretty meaningful distinction here. And I think that's particularly also true on the residential side, where it's much more bifurcated based on ownership type. But I think at the higher end of the commercial market, which has continued to do quite well throughout the pandemic, just in terms of occupancy and leasing compared to their other parts of the market, you see a lot of focus on this.
I think what the dates and the targets and the fees have done is created a certitude that can now go into a project P&L. So really, what you're doing on my end or in real estate is every project is basically a mini project finance exercise. What's the CapEx? What's the OpEx? What are the rebates? And what are the penalties? So now the penalty has become something real that we can model in. So the typical capital event will be a boiler, right? You have a piece of equipment which has a 15 to say 25-year expected useful life, It's at the end of that life, now you have to make a decision. Typically what would have happened is if you hire a mediocre consulting engineer, they will come in, look at the nameplate on the piece of equipment and give you a 2022 version of a 1980 something piece of equipment. Now we've gone all through efficiency, we've tightened buildings, we've done air sealing, we'll do a new load calc, right, to right size that new piece of equipment, and the question is, do we decarbonize now, or do we put in something which is still cheaper to put in and cheaper to operate in today's environment to replace that? And I think really we're, fortunately, for better or for worse, we're at the point where we can actually model these penalties in and they become a real cost of doing business. So it's gone from a nice to do to a must do.
So we all want to avoid the penalties. Samuel, could you talk a little bit about what the city is doing to help building owners comply with the law?
Absolutely. And first, I want to start with addressing the uncertainty around. We all talked about it. Department of Buildings, by law, from the very beginning, we knew that Department of Buildings would release guidance by January 1st, 2023, just around the corner. But we know that they've been working hard along this whole time, and we know that it's forthcoming. The rules and guidance will be released very soon, so I would stay tuned about that. And just to point out resources, there's two programs that I work on. One is the New York City Accelerator. Many of you here are familiar with it. If you're not, there's a couple of outreach folks from the team. Cassandra Walker and Rosabel Tavares are here with us. And yeah, the New York City Accelerator is free technical assistance to any private building owner. And working with the program, they can help you understand how the law applies to your building, depending on what kind of building it is, affordability status, and then how to calculate, where you stand versus the potential fines. And, our chief climate officer always says this, and before that, the council member who helped champion this law, the city does not want your fines. This is not the Climate Fine Act. This is a Climate Mobilization Act. We're trying to reduce emissions and to get to that 10% reduction that I mentioned before, to get to those green jobs. I think it's really about acting now, efficiency first, low carbon operations, and then having a plan to get off of that carbon in the future, whatever makes sense for your building. So the New York City Accelerator is one big resource that I'll point to. We're actually about to launch a Local Law 97 specific outreach and assistance campaign starting in September. So you're going to start seeing a lot of marketing around that. So it's a great time to get in touch with the program. We have so many account managers standing by to assist you. The other program I wanted to mention is the New York City Carbon Challenge, which Zach, you briefly touched on earlier, and that's it's a voluntary leadership initiative. So many leading organizations across the city representing different sectors, commercial office buildings, residential, hospitals, hotels, and even retail on climate leadership. They've really raised the ambition and put themselves out there and said, look, we're going to reach this goal by this date, and we're going to share all of our lessons learned with all of our peers. I think that kind of sharing, that kind of partnership is really important, and that's what's ultimately going to get everyone across the finish line.
There's also another program that NYSERDA is running called the Empire Building Challenge. I see there's a few developers that are participating in that program. It's taking 10 developers at a time and really pushing them to think differently about decarbonization and electrification. And they surround themselves with a number of technical advisors and financial advisors. Ecosystem is one of the technical advisors. And they're putting out some really impressive results that are shared publicly. So I encourage everyone to look at those too.
Yeah, they have case studies, which I find incredibly helpful to kind of articulate the challenges and path forward.
We've really been focused on what's necessary to comply with the law in the 2025 to 2030 period. It's an ambitious 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Looking, though, to the longer term, the law requires an 80% reduction by 2050. And personally, I can get my head around the 40% reduction. I know that's a lot of work, and you all are busy on that. But the 80% reduction seems like a bit of a stretch. Looking to the longer term, what types of solutions are necessary to achieve that? And Hannah, if you could start us off.
It's funny you're starting with me. I hope the grid gets greener, to be honest with you. It's a little frustrating that this falls on our shoulders when there's so much outside in the utility programs that needs to happen. And I'm hoping we get there that way. Beyond that, I really want to impress on everyone that like there's some things that can happen now and that need to happen now, but the landscape is going to change dramatically by 2030, hopefully, knock on wood, whatever. But it's going to look really different. And so at that point, you can have a different plan, and it's okay to change because there's just a myriad of options of getting there. And at that point, in 2030, I think we reassess and we try to look at those longer term strategies.
So I think one of the interesting facts when you look at the data that I take away is in order to assure that you don't have any fines in 2050, the grid needs to decarbonize like it's planned to. But you also need to convert 80% of your heating to electrification. So it's only 80%. It's not a full electrification. And that's important because you can significantly reduce the capex of your building if you're doing that hybrid. We calculated that you need a third amount of equipment, like air source heat pumps, to do 80% decarbonization in your building. And the rest is done sort of with like a peaker plant, which is really just a boiler. I also think that boiler is helpful for resiliency. I know that's a hot take to some people who want full decarbonization immediately, but I don't know. It's New York City, it's Con Ed. Superstorm Sandy wasn't that long ago, but that's just me. You need to start thinking heat pumps. I know you don't want to focus on the technology, but you want to focus your building on getting ready for future technologies.
So I'm just a lobbyist. I don't actually do engineering. I don't really know how it works. But I do think it's important to just sort of step back from the policy perspective for a second here, right? So New York City's got this law, but New York State also has a law that is not exactly the same as New York City and actually kind of could do something totally different from what New York City wants to do as we look out over the long term, right? So the state has this law called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, and that's the law that actually is going to make Local Law 97 work because it's the law that mandates all of these reductions over time in GHG emissions from electricity generation. But what it also calls for is effectively a net zero carbon economy in the state of New York in 2050. And so the state over the next couple of years is going to be going through this pretty rigorous rulemaking process where the state could come in and say, we actually want buildings to do something different. Like we want to not measure buildings in terms of carbon, we want to measure them in terms of energy. And you could see the state do something that looks very different from the policy perspective. So I think it's important just as you look out at like what is the future going to hold, for everybody to hold in their heads that there's actually two processes going on, and while it would be great if they were aligned, the city and the state don't always have the best track record of doing exactly the same thing. And so part of what's going to happen is over time this is all going to have to get resolved. And the state is doing a lot of really interesting things here, right? They're putting a bunch of money into looking at, okay, can we actually meaningfully develop green hydrogen at scale, for example, right? How would we reasonably develop battery storage that could be put into buildings at scale? And the city, how do we get over the fire department's objections to using battery storage in buildings? All these things are going to have to get worked out and operationalized and like put into sync if we're going to get to this long-term 2050 objective.
Yeah,
I
please.
just add, I think you raised a really good point. In terms of, a lot of times we speak about electrification synonymously with decarbonization. And electrification is one tool towards decarbonization. Prior to coming to Fairstead, I was at Con Ed. I see some of my former colleagues. And one thing you start to appreciate is the massiveness of both the gas, the steam, and the electric infrastructure, and the upgrades that are needed in order to be able to handle both the electrification, and as we're talking about gas to be there as a backup and resilient, well, just like an emergency generator, that has to be maintained. You're gonna have, right, that cost has to be amortized over fewer therms flowing through that network. So those issues need to be thought about both in terms of decarbonization, keeping the lights on, and resiliency. And I think one of the areas that still needs a lot of work is tariffs. Right? Tariffs are ultimately what show up in a P&L of a project and for any building operator. And tariffs would really need to be rationalized to reflect the costs and the benefit to society of this massive switch which is being initiated right now.
Sorry if I said anything derogatory about Con Ed. I love my power.
So it looks like we only have a few minutes left. At this point, we should see if anyone in the audience has questions for our panel. Yes, sir, please.
If you've got a question, raise your hand. I will bring a mic around.
You've touched on that commercial properties, it's much easier to get the owners of commercial properties on board and to educate them. And they're going to look at the pro forma and its return on investment, and they're going to charge it to the tenant. When it comes to residential, though, you can't pass it along in New York. It's a real problem. How is NYCHA going to handle all that? All of the units that they have? And what do you do about rent control and rent stabilization? Because the owners are not going to be able to afford it.
So I can address the affordable housing part first. The way the law is designed, owners of buildings that have at least 35% rent-regulated units cannot have an alternate path to compliance. So rather than meeting the emissions limits, they can install or implement 13 measures that are relatively low cost, can typically be done in-house, and these are things like putting controls on your radiators, setting the temperatures to an adequate temperature, insulating pipes. There's 13 things. They look and sound a lot like retrofit commissioning measures, so that has to be completed by December 31st, 2024. So rather than meeting emissions limits, they can do a bunch of building tune-up measures. So that's for affordable housing has at least 35% of their units rent regulated. For those who have fewer than 30%, 35% by at least one, they have an additional 2 years to meet their 2024 targets. So for everyone else, they have to meet the emissions limits 2024. These buildings have additional 2 years. And then for the subset of buildings that are income restricted, for instance, Mitchell-Lama program buildings, they need to meet their 2024 limit in 2034. So they have an additional 10 years. So it is designed to not negatively impact affordable housing, but it's important to decarbonize this sector as well because these New Yorkers who live in these buildings also deserve to live in clean and healthy buildings. So NYCHA is also not exempt from this law, but they have a different they have a portfolio-wide approach. So rather than having individual buildings need to meet it, they need to meet this overall portfolio percentage reduction by 2030.
There are a lot of opportunities for adjustment in the law depending on the actual building. So if you're proving that you're making a best effort, whether it's energy efficiency or electrification, and you can put that case in front of them and they'll consider that and adjust your limits.
Sir, you had a question in the back?
Yeah, I think we've got time for one more.
I just want to say, I hear your frustration around that. I think NYCHA is a big question mark, and just want to acknowledge that it is frustrating. Yeah.
I have more of a comment than a question. I work with Con Edison in the energy efficiency program. My job is quite literally to help customers identify energy efficiency projects and then help them fund those projects. So we'll pay up to 70% of a project cost depending on the type of technology that is being installed. I'm here with a colleague. So if you would like to learn about our program, we will take you through the program and then help you apply for the project and make sure you receive the incentive.
Does anyone have a question? Here we go.
So I'm president of my co-op board, and over the years we have put in heat timers, computerized the heat timer, put new windows in, insulated our building, put in a membrane, done all these things. Short of degasifying, because we converted from oil to gas because we were required to, if we go to the grid and the grid is dirty, how do we comply? And I can't get my tenants or my shareholders to go in and rip their apartments apart to go put in new projects, new energy saving devices.
Yeah, it's a challenge. We've run into that we've run into that problem a number of times with co-op boards because everybody has a strong opinion. It really depends on your specific circumstances, both with the board politically and also with the technical part of the building, the actual distribution and the energy production. The best I can offer you is a tour of the building that we're doing just south of Union Square. to show you what they did and how we're doing it with them, just because you need to align everyone's interests. You need to get that political will to make that transition, because it is slightly invasive if you want to completely electrify. That's not the only option. There's a lot more options out there, both from the energy production standpoint to the energy consumption perspective. So that's the best I can offer. That wasn't super helpful.
I'm by no means an expert here, but I think behavioral economics is going to come into play for a lot of these solutions, and that's politics and politicking, and like, again, I'm not that person. I'm an engineering background, but I really do think that we're ignoring the human aspect of this program, and that getting people on board with it is going to be critical to that alignment that Adam just mentioned.
I mean, money talks, right? So if you show them the fines that they're going to be experiencing in the future, that might sway some people's decision. No? All right.
Terrific. Let's give a big round of applause for our opening panel.